Today's daf is daf Nun Hey, and we're going to start with the Mishnah on daf Nun Dalid Amid Beis. Familiar Mishnah because we say it in davening in the Karbanos. Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur. Now, Shlomim, in general, by general rule, do not come in a Tzibur package. They're Shalmei Yochid. However, on Shavuos, we have something called Kivsei Atzeres, and then Ashamos. Now, the Mishnah is listing Kodesh Kodeshim, so it's very interesting that Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur, to the best of my knowledge, are the only Shlomim that have the status of Kodesh Kodeshim. And Eluhein Hashamos. Now we have a list of 5 categories of Hashamos. Hasham Gzelos. Now, Hasham Gzelos is not just a Gazlan who stole something, but he, let's say, took a false oath that he doesn't owe somebody money, or that he never received a pikadon, and there's a shvuas hapikadon. If he lied under oath, then besides paying keren v'chomesh, he also has to bring a korban asham. And then there's Hasham Be'ilos. That's if a person absconded with something that belongs to Hegdesh and it was worth at least a shava pruta. And then we have an Asham Shivcha Charufa, which means that 2 Jewish Shutfim owned a Shivcha Knanis. One was Meshacher, the Shivcha, the other was not. So she's like a half Shivcha Knanis, a half Bas Yisrael, because one of the 2 Shutfim removed his ownership. And if somebody has relationship with her, then a Jewish person has a relationship with her, she's a Chetzia Shivcha, Chetzia Bas Chorin, then he has to bring a Korban Hasham Shivcha Charufa. Then we go on to Hasham Nazir. So this is a Nazir who accepted himself Nazirus, and then he contracted Tumah inadvertently from a mess. And he has to go through a whole process of Tahara. At the culmination of this whole process of Tahara, he has to bring a Korban Asham. And then there's an Hasham Mitzorah, and the Mitzorah who is Tameh because of Tzaras, now he has to go through a process of Tahara, a 7-day period of time. On the 8th day, he brings 3 korbanos, one of which is an asham. Asham Toli is someone who ate one of 2 pieces, one of which was chelev, the other was shuman, and he doesn't know whether he ate the chelev, and he's chayiv kares. Again, he's a shogeg, so he brings a korban tolui, asham tolui. And in all these 5 cases, shchitasa betzafon, like any kodesh kodeshim, the shchita has to be in the tzafon. Exactly where the tzafon is a machlokas tanoim. But v'kibul dam b'klisharis betzafon, and the Kabbalas Adam, like the shchita, has to be in the tzafon. V'dam and ton shtei matanos shein arba. So you need 2 matanos like in a diagonal, so that the dam will flow down diagonally. And like in an X, you'll cover all 4 corners of the Mizbech, and that's called Shtaim Shein Arba. In other words, these have to be eaten, as we'll soon see, by Zichrei Kahuna in any shape or form, but they have to eat it within the Kloim. Now, the word Kloim comes from the Mishkan, but it's really the equivalent in the Beis HaMikdash of the area that's called Azara, and the Zichrei Kun have to eat all these hashamos within the confines of the Azara. He calls it the courtyard. Honestly, you lose a lot here in the English translation, but be that as it may, Zichrei Kun l'chol machol, he can eat it any way he likes, cook it, fry it, etc. L'yom v'layla chatzos. Now, actually, the Zichrei Kun are allowed to eat Kodesh Kodeshim during the day of the Hakrova and the entire night that follows. But the Rabbana made a gzera, laharchik sodom and avera, and they said, eat it by chatzos, because if they delay it and they go to sleep and they whatever happens, and then they bring it the next morning, well, the next morning it's nosar. So to guarantee that they don't get involved in nosar, which is an isur chomer ma'od, they told him eat it before chatzos. Now, just on the side, before we start today's daf, a korban pesach also has to be eaten before chatzos, but if you paskin a lot of Rishon pasach like Rav Lozman Azariah, that din is doraisa. That's not our chaka derabanan, because chatzos is the latest time for the mitzvah of achilas korban pesach. That's why we eat the afikomen, which is zecher le korban pesach. We eat it before chatzos. Okay, let's start the Gemara. Minolan de boy tzofan. Now, once the Gemara is asking, how do we know that you need tzofan for koche kochim? Well, guess what? We already know it from Ola, and we already know it from chatos. Chatos, by derivation from Ola, that's called a hekesh. Ola, it says explicitly that it has to be in the tzofan. But now the question is, how do we derive ashamos? And there are two ways of going, because you can compare ashamos to chatos, because there's a hekesh between asham and chatos, or you could take asham and go all the way back to Ola. So Tani Rabba Bar Chanukah, he says the following: Vasisem seir izim echad lechatos. Okay, so it takes us back to the special korbanos of Chag HaShavuos, which is Kivsei Atzeres we mentioned earlier, Eshtei Alechem, and finally the seir izim lechatos. Now, in the Torah itself, in that pasuk, the seir izim, which obviously comes from goats, a male goat, is compared to the classic shlomim korban, and that korban shlomim is in turn compared to the chatos. So we have the following string here. We're going to take the kivsei atzeres, which are the shlomim shel tzibur, and we're going to equate that with the sir izim echad lechatos because of the equation. And once we get to chatos will automatically bring us over to Ola, where the Torah explicitly requires tzofan, is ma chatos b'tzofan af shalmei tzibur b'tzofan. So the Gemara says the following: I don't get it. Amalei Rava v'chi chatos meichel l'meidu me'ola. Chatos itself, the Torah doesn't require explicitly tzofan, but rather it's me'ola. We derive from an equation to Ola. And now we get back to the rules that we spent a lot of time on about how to derive halachas and kachin. Can you get a hekesh, number one, between chatos and Ola, and number two, between asham and chatos, so that A teaches B and B teaches C? That's a no-go, because we came to the conclusion that Dover Alomi Behekesh ain't a choser umalami Behekesh. Ella, but rather we have to find an alternative source from which we derive that Shalmei Tzivur required Safon, and that's me to Tani Rabbi Mori Berei to Rav Kahana al Olosechem ve'al Zivchei Shalmechem. Now here we have a very fine hekesh, because we're equating in the pasuk Shlomim back to Ola. I dropped that whole middle line of chatos. Ma Ola kochi kochim av zivchei shalmei tzibur kochi kochim. Okay, that has to do with other dinim as far as what's called the psul yotze is concerned. Also has to do with, as Rashi points out, the tum of tful yom. But whatever it is, that's not the part of the brisa that we're interested in. We want the end of the brisa that says ma ola b'tzafon af shalmei zivchei shalmei tzibur b'tzafon. So now we're going to go back to the original derivation that we suggested the name of Rabbi Bar Chanan, and that was Vasisem Seir Izem Echol Chatos, which granted us an equation between Shalmei Tzibur and Chatos. What do we need that for? We now have an equation between Shalmei Tzibur and Ola. Ola is the original. Ola is where the Torah requires Safon. In other words, the Gemara thinks now that a Hekesh is not an empty set. There may be halachas that go beyond the purview of the Hekesh, but the Hekesh has to be meaningful for something. What halach do I derive from the equation between Chatos and Shalmei Tzibur? Ma Chatos ein nechal zichrei kahuna af zivchei Shalmei Tzibur lezichrei kahuna. Shlomim in general, because they are kochim kalim, can be eaten by anyone, not necessarily a kohen. And now we're upgrading Shalmei Tzibur, even though it's a shlomim, to a high profile level equivalent to chatos, and it's koche kochim. And therefore the Shalmei Tzibur can only be eaten by zichrei kahuna. Now, let's assume the Shalmei Tzibur were divvied up amongst the Kohanim who are on the Mishmeres, and they want to share it with Yisrael. They want to be very magnanimous, forthcoming, so they want to share it with Yisrael. No, they can't do that. Because the status of Shalmei Tzibur, which is very unique, it's not Shlomim, but rather it's Kochim. Amalei Abaye is not happy with this derivation of what do you call it, Zichrei Kahuna. Ihachi gabi El Nazir, we have a similar equation in the case of El Nazir, right? The Nazir has to bring an ayal, and his ayal is Hikriv es Korbanol Hashem Keves Ben Shnaso Tomim Echad Liolav Ekavsa Achas Bashnasot Mimol Chatos V'ayal Echad Tom L'Shlomim. So here we have in this pasuk a case of chatos, right? It says kivsa achas, etc., lechatos, and in the same breath the Torah mentions ayal echad l'shlamim. Now we know for a fact that el nazir could be eaten by anyone. It doesn't have to be eaten by zichrei kahuna. Is hachinami nema hikish akosiv l'chatz machatz sein nechel zichrei kahuna, so to af el nazir nami ein nechel zichrei kahuna? That's not correct. So we're stuck with an immovable mover over here, because we're really against the heart, between a rock and a hard place, because your hekesh, according to the original position here, was meant to teach us zichrei kahuna, but we have a hekesh not only between Shalmei Tzibur and chatos, we also have a hekesh between El Nazir and Chatos. Now, El Nazir is not limited to Zichrei Kahuna. So now Rava is sort of on the defense. Hachi Hashta. Abaye seems to have really, knocked Rava out of the rink. But no. Hasam Kevet Chsiv. V'lakach HaKohen es Hazroa b'Shela mina ayil. This is called the Zroa B'Shela. Zroa B'Shela means that they used to cook the aisle of the Nazir together with the Zroa. The Zroa was not removed for the purpose of prior to the cooking. Is Michlal de Kuli Bailim Achlile. In other words, from the fact that it says that the Zroa B'Shela of the aisle is designated for the Kohen, we derive by implication that the rest of the aisle is given to anyone. And the Kohanim don't have the exclusive, rights over the rest of the aisle. They just have the Zroa B'Shela of the aisle. So this is a slug up to Abaye, because Abaye wanted to say that the El Nazir could be eaten by anyone. Lav dafka Kohanim. But here you see very, very clearly that the Kohen gets his portion. What's his portion is Roa B'Shelah. Mashma that the rest of the ayal is the remainder of the balance is for everyone. So Abai says, Roa B'Shelah mio lo lis'akel el zichrei kuhuna. In other words, are you going to tell me that because the pasuk of Ayal Nazir says V'lakach HaKohen Es Hazro B'Shelah, that therefore it means only a Kohen is allowed to eat the Ayal B'Shelah? That's not true. He can give it to his Eved. He has an Eved Kanani that he owns. He can share it with the Eved. He can certainly share it with his wife and his children. So if this be the case, then there's no requirement of restricting the achila of the Zroa B'Shelah to male Kohanim. That's not so. And therefore, we're left with a kasha on Rava, because Rava wanted to suggest that on the one hand, the Zroa B'Shelah could only be eaten by Zichrei Kuna, and that's where the pasuk says Lakacha Kohen is Zroa B'Shelah, and the remainder of the aisle could be eaten by anyone. But now we're seeing that even with regard to the Zroa B'Shelah, he can feed it and share it with his wife, with an Eved Kanani. How's Rava going to deal with that? Rava says it's only eaten l'zichrei kuna. Gosh. However, ibais ema, if you really press me on it, says, well, I'll come up with an answer. Kodshei ikri, kodshei kodshim lo ikri. We know that there's a fundamental difference between kodshei kodshim and kodshim, meaning kodshim kalam. In the case of kodshei kodshim, and only in the case of kodshei kodshim, did the Torah allow the Kohen and only the Kohen to eat from the karma. So it's interesting. The Gemara now is saying that kodshim ikri. What does it mean, kodshim ikri? In other words, the Torah refers to the Zroa B'Shelah as kodshim. And what the Torah is doing is the Torah is telling you that the Zroa B'Shelah could only be eaten by Zichrei Kahuna. And if that would be the case, then you'd obviously classify Nazir, Ayal Nazir, as Kodshei Kodshim, but we know that it's not Kodshei Kodshim. So if it's not Kodshei Kodshim, then anybody could eat the Zroa B'Shelah. So what the Torah does is the Torah says about the El Nazir, it's Kodesh. And we're going to be Medayik Kodesh, but not Kodesh Kodashim. And therefore, anyone, even in Israel, could eat from the Zroa B'Shelah. But yet, on the other hand, the Torah compared the Zroa B'Shelah to the Chatas. Well, what was the purpose of doing so? If anybody could eat it. Omar Rava, Shem Gilach al Echad Mishlosh Dan Yotza, it's coming to teach me another halacha. And that is that even though the Nazir, after he completes his Naziris, he has to bring 3 different categories of Kodshim, of Karbanos, but once he brings one of them, he's Yotze. And therefore, all the restrictions of a Nazir are removed. And that's called, in the Lashon of Rava, Gilach al Echad Mishloshtan Yotze. And now we start the new mission. Hatoda v'el Nazir Kodshim Kalim. So that's what we said before, that El Nazir is only Kodshim Kalim. That's why it could be eaten by anyone. Lav Dafka, it's not only restricted to Zichrei Kahuna. And the Korban Toda likewise could be eaten by anyone. And that is a reflection of the fact that we categorize these 2 Korbanos as Kodshim Kalim. and therefore shchitas b'chol makom b'azara. Like any carbon shlamim, the shechita could be done anywhere in the azara. It doesn't have to be in the tzafon. And daven ton shtei matanos shein arba, which again means the shortcut here. You don't have to actually put it on the four corners of the mizbeach, just the diagonals, the two diagonals. V'nechal b'chol ha'ir, it means that Toda and El Nazir, the basar, could be eaten anywhere in the city of Yerushalayim. L'chol adam, meaning you don't require kohanim. B'chol machal, make it fried, make it roast, make it whichever way you like it. Liyom v'layla ad chatzos. So herein lies the difference between shlomim in general and Toda and El Nazir. The Gemara is going to derive this. In the case of shlomim, you get 2 days and 1 night. That means the day of the Havas HaKarban, the night ale, which is sandwiched into the next day. And the next day, you could also eat the basar or the karban. But not so in the case of Toda and El Nazir. They only get one day and 1 night, the following night, and that makes them into Kodshi Kodshim. And again, as we said before, Ad Chatzos, Rabbanan made Arachak, and they said, you know what? You better eat up the El Nazir or the Karban Toda before Chatzos. Otherwise, I'm afraid that you'll leave it over until the next morning. Hamur mehem kayotze behem. So he says Hamur behem refers to 2 different parts of the body of the animal. And basically, we're talking now about shlomim in general and Toda and Nazir specifically. And what are these 2 parts of the body? This is the right foreleg. And again, let's just point out here that in the Nazir, the Ayil Nazir, the Torah says explicitly that we have to give it to the Kohanim. Elahamuram necha lekohanim, l'neshayim livneim ulavdeim. So again, what the Mishnah is telling me is that to some extent, we have an overlap between the karbanos of Maser and of El Nazir and Kodshim Kalim. But at the same time, we have a departure, a contrast, where Shlomim are eaten for 2 days, El Nazir and Toda are eaten for only 1 day and 1 night.
Okay. So what's it saying? It's saying basically that it can be eaten by non-Kohanim, but there are certain portions that only can be eaten by Kohanim?
Well, what we're saying now is that El Nazir and Toda, even though there's some element, at least in the case of El Nazir, of exclusivity for the Kohen, and the reason for that is because the Torah says it is his, it belongs to the Kohen, so you're going to give certain parts or limbs of the El Nazir to the Kohen, and only the Kohen is allowed to eat them. But in terms of the balance of the El Nazir, knows all other parts except for the foreleg, he calls it the foreleg, the thigh of the right leg, and the breast. And it seems that in the case of the Nazir, it has to be given to the Kohanim, and so now now we go on to Toda. So again, let's just emphasize the Mishnah says that Hamuram, that which is separated, Nechal leKohanim. The Kohanim have a right to share it with Nisheim Ubneim, and Avdeim. But a regular Yisrael, who's not a relative or owned as an Eved is by the Kohen, they cannot eat the Muram. The Muram means these portions that are separated. So again, with regard to all kachim, there's something called chazav v'shok, right? Chazav v'shok is the breast and the thigh of the right hind leg. That's every shlomim. And those are given to the Kohanim, and the Kohanim could decide to share it with whoever they want. So that's what you call Mammon Kohen. With regard to the El Nazir, it seems that the Torah changed the status of an El Nazir because even though it's classified technically as Kodshim Kalim, but it does have a unique status that's very similar to that of what do you call it, of Kodshi Kodshim. And that's called Hamuram Nechal leKohen. He here quotes the pasuk Veschaza Shok, Shochuma Tochlu Atov Benechem Nosech Itoch. Yeah. So again, we'll see a little bit more as we go along about Hamura Mehem. Those portions which have to be separated. As I said, it has to do with the right foreleg. If we had more time, we'd go through the psukim inside. Or maybe if you have a chance, I don't know if you have a chumash in front of you, if you could open up to the Bamidbar Perek Vav, Pasuk Yutes. Maybe I have it here in the Torah or. I'm not sure. No. No, I don't have it here. Okay, let's go on. Tana Rabbana, we learned in a brayso. Veschazei hatrufa shok hatruma. This is a general halacha regarding all shlomim. Tochlu b'makom tahar. So they have to be eaten anywhere in Yerushalayim but b'makom tahar. And you cannot take shlomim, basar shlomim, outside of the confines of Yerushalayim. Amar Rab Nechemya, v'chi rishonim bituma acholum, meaning, why did the Torah, and in this case it happens to be Moshe Rabbeinu, why did he have to go out of his way to say that when you get to chazeh truma v'shoka truma, that it should be eaten b'makom Torah? I mean, everything that we know about shlomim, it's kodshim, and you don't eat kodshim in the state of tumah or when it becomes tameh. Ella, says Rab Nechemya, when it says in the pasuk b'makom Torah, what it really means is michlal shu tameh. In other words, there's some admixture here of tumah v'tara. Because again, if it's purely tara, then that's totally superfluous. We know that it's tara. I mean, the entire parasha beforehand deals with all the kodshim that have to be v'tara. So he comes up with the following, like lumdisha slice here. It's tar mitumas mitzora, but tameh mitumas za. Okay, so for this we have to know a little bit more about the Gimel Machnos, right? There's Machne Shechina, Machne Levia, Machne Yisrael. Machne Yisrael is equal to Yerushalayim in general, right? And Machne Levia is the Azaros, and Machne Shechina is already the Heichal and the Kodesh Kadoshim. So what do we have over here? We have tumas mitzora as opposed to tumas zav. Now, tumas zav in this particular context, I'm not going to say it's a general rule, is more chamur, is a more severe tuma than tumas mitzora. So that a mitzora would be allowed to eat kodshim kalim in the city of Yerushalayim, where kodshim are eaten. However, a zav is excluded even from Machne Yisrael, which is Yerushalayim. Let me just double check I got that right. Oh, yeah. So, I mean, Rashi points out you can't allow a mitzora. Okay, he's not on the level of a zav, so that tumah he doesn't have. So 1 second. Let me backtrack once more. Tar mitumas mitzora, vitame mitumas zav. So the halacha of mitzora is that he gets shiluach misholosh machnos, and the mitzora has to go out of Yerushalayim. He can't even enter into Yerushalayim. A zav can enter into Yerushalayim. He cannot go. I don't think he's allowed to go in the Harabais, but he certainly is allowed anywhere in Yerushalayim. So in that sense, a mitzora is more chomer than a zav. So Moshe Rabbeinu tells Aaron to eat the shlomim in a place that's tahar, tochlenu b'makom tahar, and that means anywhere in the Machne Yisrael, anywhere in Yerushalayim. So the Gemara questions this drasha, or maybe the Brisa itself is questioning. I'm not sure. V'ema tar mitumas zav, v'tari mitumas mes. Maybe the Torah is saying is that even though zav is not as its tumah is not as chomer as that of mitzora, but nevertheless, maybe the Torah is holding that it still is close to that of a mitzora. And therefore, it would have to be excluded from Machna Levia. Right? Machna Levia is sort of like in the middle, in between the two extremes. I see we're running out of time. This is not good. Okay, there's a lot of complicated Taras issues here, but basically what we're saying is just the bottom line is that shlomim could be eaten in Machna Levia, but not in Yerushalayim. Just 1 second. In other words, we're restricting shlomim to the Machna Levia. Omar Abaye, Omar Krov, achaltem osa b'makom kadosh. Okay, now we're going into the Korban Mincha. Osa b'makom kadosh, but there's a miut here, the word osa, v'lo acheres b'makom kadosh. The acheres here is the Korban Toda, what we call lachme Toda. So even though the mincha itself, after the kmitza, what we call shiari mincha, have to be eaten in a Makom Kadosh, but the Osa is telling me that as far as the Lachmei Toda is concerned, they don't have to be eaten in a Makom Kadosh, which means they don't need the Azara. So the Mincha has to be eaten in the Azara, but any other baked goods used in the context of a carbon, like Toda, the Lachmei Toda, or the Nazir also has to bring Rikike Toda. So they are not considered carbon mincha, and they're not restricted to the azar. The achil is not restricted to the azar. Afke lemachne levia. So we go one step at a time. Meaning that if the mincha is limited to the azara, and we had the miut of osa, then we're telling us, the Torah is telling us that lachmei toda, which are only kodshim kalim, are not limited to machne levia and hariksiv b'makom tahar afke l'machne Yisrael. So each one of these, mi'utim expand the area in which you're allowed to eat kodshim kalim. Rav has a different drasha. Osa b'makom kodesh v'lo acheres b'makom kodesh. The mincha has to be eaten in the azara, and other karbonos that have the status of kodshim kalim, they could be eaten even in Machne Yisrael, which means even beyond Machne Yisrael. But Hadar Kosvach, now the Torah puts it back in Tochlu b'makom tar, Aile l'Machne Yisrael, and they could only be eaten in Yerushalayim. Ve'ema Aile l'Machne Levia. Maybe the Torah wants to go even stricter, and they have to be eaten in the Azara. Or Machne Levia here in this case means the Harabayis is l'chad ma'ilinon l'tarte lo ma'ilin, right? So we're not going to skip a step over here. Yihochi afuke nami. So this should apply also in terms of the psul yotze, where you're not allowed to take kodshim kalim outside of machne shchina. Is michad afkeinon mitarte lo mafkeinon. Okay, so the Gemara eventually rejects this, and Elamachvar took it Abai. We go back to Abai. Okay, I think we're running out of time, so let's see if we can at least chop around to the rest of the end of the Yom. Shlomim kodshim kalim shchitos b'chol mokum b'azara davar ton shtei maton shein arba. Nechon v'chol ha'ir, l'chol odom v'chol machol, l'shnei yomim v'layla echad, hamurim mehem kayotzi b'hem, mean that which you separate you have to give to the Kohanim, elish hamurim nechol, l'kohanim l'shem v'leim v'avdeh. Ton rabbanim, ushchato pesach ha'ol moed, v'shachat, 3 times the Torah repeats itself, v'shachat oso l'fnei ol moed, v'shachat oso l'fnei ol moed. Lahachshir is kol haruchos b'kodshim kalim. Anywhere in the Azor you're allowed to shecht kodshim kalim, whether it's directly in front of the heichal or it's alongside that area, right? As long as the as long as the doors are open, right? Is kal v'chomer l'tzofa. Meaning, if Kachim could be shechted in Sofan, then certainly Kachim Kalim should be shechted in Sofan. And the Gemara is going to later on ask, so what was the Hava mean? Uma Kachim Shalo Hukshu B'chol Aruchos. Is Hukshu B'tzofan, right? Kachim would need Tzofan, is Kachim Kalim Hukshu B'chol Aruchos. Right? As we said before, you could shecht Kachim. I'm sorry, Kachim Kalim B'chol Aruchos. Right? Doesn't mean you're not limited to Tzafon, Daram, or Mizrach, or Ma'arav. Is Einudin Shukshu B'Tzafon. However, Rabbi Eliezer holds that there's a Havamina that you cannot shecht Kachim Kalim Shlomim in the Tzafon. Lo Nemar HaKosvel Lahachshir Tzafon. I need a pasuk to say that you're allowed to do the shechita of kachim kalim of shlomim in the tzafon. Why? Shiachal, I might have thought, hello dinhu. I'm going to apply the rigid principle of a kal v'chomer. Ba kachim kalim shehuchshu b'chol aruchos. Lo huchshu b'makomon eitzel kachim. I mean, at this point, in the logic of the kal v'chomer of Belos, we don't know whether or not you could shecht the carbon in the tzafon. Kachim shelo huchshu ela b'tzafon ein adin shelo huchshar makomon eitzel kachim kalim. Let's go over it one more time. I know you have to go. This is not really a 45-minute daf. Ma kachim shuchshu b'chol aruchos lo huksha makomon eitzel kachim. Right, that the makom that is okay for shchitas kachim kalim, that means darom, mizrach, and ma'arav, is not available for shchitas kachim. Is kachim shel huksha ela b'tzafon eno din shelo huksha makomon eitzel kachim kalim. You're telling me in the case of kachim kalim, you can't shecht kachim in any of those places of the ruchos. Then how much more so that kachim should teach you that only kachim could be shechted in the tzafon, but not kachim kalim. Talmud Loma Ol Moed, and therefore we need the drasha of Ol Moed to be matir shchitas kachim kalim in the tzafon.